The guard's hand went up like a wall. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." Irene Hill stood at the gates of Thornfield Military Base, her worn coat buttoned against the autumn wind, a small leather box clutched in her trembling hands. Behind those gates was the truth everyone had buried, the answers they'd hoped she'd never find. "I have every right to be here," she said quietly. The guard laughed, reaching for his radio. That's when she opened the box. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a medal that hadn't seen daylight in 30 years. A medal that would make a 3-star general drop everything and come running. But before that moment, Irene had to survive being the daughter no one believed, the woman everyone dismissed, and the keeper of a secret that would shake the entire base to its foundation. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Irene Hill had been awake since 3 in the morning, though sleep had been a stranger for weeks. She sat at the small kitchen table in her London flat, the same table where her mother had sat for 30 years, waiting for a knock on the door that never came, waiting for answers that died with her 6 months ago. The autumn sun hadn't yet risen when Irene pulled out the old shoebox from beneath her mother's bed. She'd avoided it during the funeral arrangements, during the sorting of clothes and the distribution of modest possessions. But last night, something had drawn her back to it. Perhaps it was the dream, the recurring one where her mother stood at a military gate, calling a name that always dissolved before Irene could hear it. Inside the shoebox were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to various military offices, all returned with the same cold, bureaucratic responses. No record of the individual in question. Unable to verify the information provided. This matter has been reviewed and closed. Each rejection was dated, creating a timeline of her mother's 30-year quest for recognition, for acknowledgement, for something. But it was the item at the bottom of the box that stopped Irene's breath. A small leather case, cracked with age, containing a military medal she'd never seen before. The medal was distinctive, its design unlike anything she recognized from history books or memorial services. The ribbon was deep blue with silver edges, and the medallion itself bore an insignia that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light of her kitchen. Beneath the case was a photograph, faded and creased from being handled too many times. It showed a young man in military uniform, standing beside a woman Irene immediately recognized as her mother, decades younger, her face lit with a joy Irene had never witnessed in person. On the back, in her mother's careful handwriting, "Your father. Thornfield Base. 1994. Irene had grown up with the story, though it had always felt more like a fairy tale than history. Her mother spoke of a brief romance with a soldier, a man named William Hill who'd served with distinction before dying in an operation that officially never happened. No body. No funeral. No record. Just a young woman left pregnant and alone, her claims dismissed by a military system that insisted the man she loved had never existed. "They made him disappear," her mother used to say during her darker moments, when the weight of being called a liar for 3 decades became too heavy. "They erased him like he was nothing. Like we were nothing." Irene had spent her childhood bearing the weight of that erasure. The kids at school who whispered about her made-up father. The teachers who looked at her mother with pity during parent conferences. The extended family who'd eventually stopped asking questions and started avoiding them altogether. Her mother had become known in their community as the woman who couldn't let go of a fantasy, who'd built an entire life around a man who, according to every official record, didn't exist. But the medal in Irene's hands was real. The photograph was real. And her mother's pain, witnessed over 30 years, had been devastatingly real. Irene had spent the weeks since her mother's funeral researching. She'd learned that Thornfield Base, located in the countryside outside of Brighton, was home to a specialized military unit. Records about the base were sparse, deliberately so. Most information was classified, buried under layers of official secrecy that seemed designed to discourage exactly the kind of questions her mother had spent a lifetime asking. The medal itself had taken considerable effort to identify. After posting carefully cropped images on military history forums and reaching out to veteran organizations, Irene had finally received a message from a retired officer who'd served in the 1990s. His response had been brief and alarming. "Where did you get that?" Those medals were only awarded to members of a classified operation. They're not supposed to exist outside of secure facilities. When Irene had pressed for more information, the officer had gone silent. His forum account was deleted within 24 hours. That's when Irene decided to go to Thornfield herself. Not to ask questions through official channels that had failed her mother for 3 decades. Not to submit more paperwork to bureaucrats trained to deny and deflect. But to stand at those gates with the evidence in her hand and demand the truth. She'd taken a week off from her job at the London Library where she worked as an archivist. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her professional life preserving and organizing historical records while her own family history had been systematically destroyed. Her supervisor had been understanding when Irene explained she needed time to settle her mother's affairs, though Irene had left out the part about confronting a military base. The train from London to Brighton took just over an hour. Irene spent the journey staring at the photograph, memorizing every detail of her father's face. He had kind eyes, she thought. The same shape as her own. His smile carried a confidence that made her wonder what kind of man he'd been, what stories he would have told her, what advice he might have given. Her mother had shared fragments over the years. How they'd met at a pub near the base. How he'd talked about serving something bigger than himself. How he'd promised to return from his deployment and marry her properly. How he'd written her letters that stopped arriving after 3 months. How officials had told her there was no record of William Hill ever serving at Thornfield, that perhaps she'd misunderstood, that perhaps she should move on. "They made me feel crazy," her mother had confessed during one of her final hospital visits, the cancer that would take her already visible in her sunken cheeks. "For 30 years, they made me doubt my own memories. But I wasn't crazy, Irene. He was real. We were real." Now, holding the medal that wasn't supposed to exist, Irene understood that her mother had been telling the truth all along. The question was why the military had worked so hard to hide it. The taxi from Brighton Station to Thornfield Base took another 30 minutes, carrying Irene through increasingly rural countryside. Stone walls lined narrow roads. Sheep grazed in fields that rolled toward distant hills. It was beautiful in the way only the English countryside could be, peaceful and timeless. It seemed an unlikely setting for buried secrets and classified operations. The base itself appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, its perimeter marked by high fences topped with security cameras. A guard checkpoint blocked the main entrance, and beyond it, Irene could see various buildings sprawling across what looked like several square miles. Military vehicles moved along internal roads, and personnel in uniform walked with purpose between structures. Irene paid the driver and stood for a moment outside the gate, feeling the weight of 3 decades of denial pressing down on her shoulders. This was where her father had served. Where he'd lived and worked before whatever happened to erase him from history. Somewhere beyond those gates were answers her mother had died without receiving. She approached the checkpoint with the leather case held carefully in both hands, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the guards could hear it. A young soldier, barely out of his teens, stepped forward from the guard station. His uniform was crisp, his expression professionally neutral. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you?" "Yes," Irene said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here to speak with someone about a soldier who served at this base. His name was William Hill, and I have evidence that." "Ma'am," the guard interrupted, his tone shifting from neutral to dismissive. "If you have inquiries about personnel records, you need to submit a formal request through the appropriate channels. This is a secure facility. I can't let civilians enter without proper authorization." "I understand that," Irene replied, maintaining her composure despite the familiar sting of dismissal. "But I've been trying the appropriate channels for months. My mother tried for 30 years before that. I'm not leaving until someone speaks with me." The guard's expression hardened. He'd probably dealt with countless civilians at these gates, each believing their issue warranted special treatment. To him, Irene was just another person who didn't understand how military protocol worked. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from the checkpoint. If you don't have authorized business here, you can't remain on military property." A second guard emerged from the station, older and more weathered. He assessed Irene with the experienced eye of someone who'd spent years distinguishing between genuine threats and mere annoyances. Clearly, he'd placed her in the latter category. "Is there a problem here?" the senior guard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "This woman is asking about personnel records," the younger guard explained. "I've informed her about the proper channels." The senior guard turned to Irene with barely concealed impatience. "Miss, military personnel records are confidential. Even if the person you're inquiring about served here, which I can neither confirm nor deny, we can't discuss individual soldiers with civilians who show up at the gate. You need to submit a Freedom of Information request, and even then, most service records remain classified for decades." "His name was William Hill," Irene said, her voice growing stronger. "He served here in 1994. He was my father, and according to every official record, he never existed. But I have proof that he did." She opened the leather case, revealing the medal. In the afternoon sunlight, its distinctive design seemed to glow with an authority of its own. The senior guard glanced at it, then looked away, his expression unchanged. "I don't know what that is or where you got it, but it doesn't change protocol. You need to leave, or I'll have to call the military police." Irene felt something crack inside her, the accumulated weight of her mother's 30-year fight, of every dismissal and denial, of growing up as the daughter of a woman everyone pitted or mocked. She promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't show weakness, but tears burned in her eyes anyway. "My mother died 6 months ago," she said, her voice breaking. "She spent her entire adult life being told she was wrong, being treated like she was delusional or lying. She died without ever getting answers, without anyone ever acknowledging that the man she loved was real. I'm not leaving until someone tells me the truth." The senior guard's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "I'm sorry for your loss, miss. Truly. But I have my orders. This is a secure facility, and I can't make exceptions, no matter how sympathetic your situation might be." He gestured to the younger guard, who reached for his radio. "Call it in. We need an escort to remove a civilian from the checkpoint." Irene's hands shook as she held the metal case. She'd expected resistance, but the casual dismissal, the complete unwillingness to even consider her evidence, felt like reliving every rejection her mother had faced. She thought about turning away, about accepting defeat the way her mother had been forced to accept it year after year. Instead, she stepped closer to the checkpoint, raising her voice so it carried across the guard station. "This medal was awarded to members of a classified operation. It's not supposed to exist outside of secure facilities. If you're going to remove me from this checkpoint, you're going to have to explain to your superiors why you ignored evidence of a security breach." The senior guard paused, his hand hovering near his radio. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He looked at the medal again, really looked at it this time, and Irene saw the moment he recognized it. His jaw tightened, and he exchanged a glance with the younger guard that communicated something Irene couldn't interpret. "Where did you get that?" the senior guard asked, his casual dismissiveness replaced by something sharper, more concerned. "From my mother's belongings," Irene replied. "Along with this photograph." She produced the picture of her mother and father, William Hill's military uniform clearly visible, Thornfield Base identifiable in the background. The senior guard studied the photograph, and Irene watched the color drain slightly from his face. "Wait here," he said abruptly, stepping back into the guard station. Through the window, Irene could see him making a phone call, his body language tense, his conversation animated. The younger guard remained at his post, watching Irene with new wariness, as if she'd transformed from a nuisance into something potentially dangerous. Minutes stretched like hours. Irene stood in the autumn sunshine, clutching the evidence of her father's existence, feeling the eyes of security cameras tracking her every movement. Military personnel passing through the checkpoint glanced at her curiously, whispering to each other. Word was spreading that something unusual was happening at the gate. The senior guard emerged from the station, his expression carefully neutral. "Someone is coming to speak with you. You'll need to wait outside the checkpoint until they arrive." "Who's coming?" Irene asked. "Someone with the authority to address your concerns," the guard replied, offering nothing more. 20 more minutes passed. Irene remained standing, refusing to show any weakness, though her legs ached and exhaustion from the sleepless night threatened to overwhelm her. She watched as activity within the base seemed to increase, vehicles moving with greater urgency, personnel gathering near buildings she couldn't identify. Then she saw him. A staff car approached from deeper within the base, flying a flag that indicated high rank. It stopped near the checkpoint, and a man emerged, his uniform decorated with medals and insignia that marked him as someone of considerable authority. He was perhaps in his 60s, his hair silver, his bearing that of someone accustomed to absolute command. The guards at the checkpoint immediately straightened, their casual professionalism replaced by rigid military precision. The senior guard saluted as the officer approached. "Sir, this is the civilian who..." The officer held up a hand, cutting off the explanation. His eyes were fixed on Irene, studying her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see not just her but the entire history that had brought her to this moment. He walked through the checkpoint, stopping a few feet from where Irene stood. Up close, she could see the lines etched deep in his face, the weight of decades of service and secrets carried in his eyes. "Miss Hill," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of authority tempered by something that might have been regret. "I'm General Andrew Pemberton, base commander. I understand you have something that belongs to us." It wasn't a question. Irene held up the metal case, her hand no longer shaking. "This belonged to my father, William Hill. The father your base insists never existed." General Pemberton's gaze moved to the metal, and Irene saw something she hadn't expected, recognition, followed quickly by what looked like pain. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if bracing himself for something difficult. When he opened them again, his voice was quieter, meant only for Irene. "That's the Valor Cross. It was awarded to 7 soldiers who participated in Operation Silent Guard in 1994. All 7 of those men were declared killed in action during that operation. Their service was classified, their records sealed. Your father was one of them." The words hung in the autumn air like smoke. Irene felt the ground shift beneath her, 30 years of denial cracking open to reveal the truth her mother had always known. "So he was real," Irene whispered. "He served here. He died serving his country." "Yes," General Pemberton said simply. "Then why?" Irene's voice rose with decades of suppressed rage and grief. "Why did you make him disappear? Why did you let my mother spend 30 years being called a liar? Why did you erase him like he never mattered?" The general looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, that carried burdens Irene couldn't imagine. "Because Operation Silent Guard was classified at the highest level. Because the mission those 7 men died completing prevented something catastrophic, and acknowledging their sacrifice would have exposed national security secrets we couldn't afford to reveal. Because sometimes, Miss Hill, good people pay terrible prices for doing the right thing." "That's not good enough," Irene said, tears streaming down her face now. "My mother deserved better. I deserved better. My father deserved to be remembered." General Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, then made a decision that Irene could see transform his entire demeanor. "You're right. You all deserved better. Miss Hill, would you please come with me? It's time someone told you the truth about your father and the men who died alongside him." He turned to the senior guard. "Grant Miss Hill visitor clearance. She's my guest." As the checkpoint barrier rose and Irene stepped onto Thornfield Base for the first time in her life, she clutched the metal that had finally opened the gates her mother had stood outside for 30 years. The truth was waiting inside. And with it, perhaps, the recognition her father had earned and her mother had died without receiving. "We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. General Pemberton led Irene through the checkpoint and onto the base proper, his stride measured but purposeful. The younger guard held open the barrier, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by careful attention. Irene noticed how every soldier they passed stopped what they were doing to salute the general, their eyes curious as they took in the civilian woman walking beside their commander. The base was larger than it had appeared from outside the gates. Buildings of various sizes lined paved roads that stretched in multiple directions. Some structures looked administrative, with windows and standard architecture. Others were windowless concrete blocks that suggested more secretive purposes. In the distance, Irene could see what looked like training facilities and vehicle maintenance areas. "I owe you an explanation," General Pemberton said as they walked. "Several explanations, actually. But first, I want to show you something." He guided her toward a building near the center of the base, a modest two-story structure that looked like it might house offices. 2 guards stood at the entrance, and they snapped to attention as the general approached. Inside, the building was quiet, almost library-like in its atmosphere. Framed photographs lined the walls, showing various military operations and ceremonies spanning decades. They climbed a staircase to the second floor, where Pemberton led her down a corridor to a door marked simply Archives. He produced a key card and swiped it through a reader. The lock clicked open. The room beyond was small, perhaps 15 feet square, with no windows. Fluorescent lights hummed to life automatically. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, all bearing security classifications and date ranges. In the center of the room stood a single table with 2 chairs. "This is the classified archive for operations conducted from this base," Pemberton explained, closing the door behind them. "What I'm about to show you is information that, technically, I'm not authorized to share with civilians. But sometimes the law and what's right don't align perfectly." He moved to one of the cabinets, unlocked it with another key, and withdrew a slim folder. The cover bore multiple classification stamps and the designation, Operation Silent Guard 1994. Pemberton set the folder on the table and opened it carefully, as if the contents were fragile. Inside were documents, photographs, and what looked like after-action reports. He pulled out a photograph and handed it to Irene. 7 men in military uniforms stood in formation, their expressions serious but proud. Irene's eyes immediately found her father, third from the left. Seeing him in a military context, among his fellow soldiers, made him suddenly more real than the single photograph with her mother had ever managed. "Operation Silent Guard," Pemberton began, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting history they'd lived through, "was a counterterrorism operation. In early 1994, intelligence indicated that a domestic extremist group had acquired Soviet-era chemical weapons components. They were planning an attack that would have killed thousands of civilians in London." Irene's breath caught. The scale of what he was describing seemed impossible, like something from a thriller novel rather than real history. "Your father and 6 other specialists from this base were tasked with infiltrating the group's compound and securing the weapons before they could be deployed. The operation required absolute secrecy. If the extremists had known we were coming, they would have accelerated their timeline. If the public had known about the threat, there would have been panic that could have destabilized the government." Pemberton pulled out another document, this one a mission brief with her father's name listed among the team members. Seeing it in official military documentation, with stamps and signatures authenticating its reality, made Irene's hands tremble. "The mission was successful," Pemberton continued. "Your father and his team secured the weapons and prevented the attack. But the compound had been rigged with explosives. The extremists triggered them when they realized they'd been infiltrated. All 7 men died in the blast." The clinical way he described it couldn't mask the tragedy. 7 families destroyed. 7 futures erased. All to save thousands who would never know how close they'd come to disaster. "Why couldn't you tell anyone?" Irene asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did their sacrifice have to be secret?" Pemberton's expression grew even more grave. "Because acknowledging the operation would have required explaining the threat. The public would have learned that chemical weapons had been inside the country, that domestic terrorists had nearly succeeded in a mass casualty attack. The political and social consequences would have been severe. So the government made a decision to classify everything about Operation Silent Guard. And the families? Irene asked. What about the people who love these men? They were told their soldiers died in training accidents or routine deployments. The Valor Cross was created specifically for this operation, to be held in classified archives as recognition of what these men accomplished. But the medals, the records, all of it was sealed. Irene stared at the photograph of her father and his team, trying to reconcile the smiling man in her mother's picture with this soldier who'd died preventing a terrorist attack. The two images didn't contradict each other, but they revealed the complexity of a life cut short. My mother knew something was wrong, Irene said. She went to military offices, wrote letters, tried everything to find out what happened to him. And everyone told her there was no record of William Hill ever serving here. Pemberton nodded, his expression pained. The classification was so complete that most personnel didn't know about Operation Silent Guard. When your mother made inquiries, the people she contacted genuinely couldn't find any record of your father. His service file had been relocated to a classified database that required special clearance to access. But someone must have known, Irene pressed. Someone could have told her the truth, given her something, even if they couldn't reveal details. You're right, Pemberton admitted. And that's where the system failed most grievously. The classification was designed to protect national security, but it also protected bureaucrats who found it easier to deny your mother's claims than to navigate the complicated process of acknowledging them without revealing classified information. He pulled out another document from the folder, this one a memo dated from 1995. Your mother's inquiries were actually flagged by military intelligence. There was concern that her persistence might draw unwanted attention to Operation Silent Guard. Instead of finding a way to quietly acknowledge your father's service while maintaining operational security, they simply reinforced the denials. Irene felt anger building in her chest, hot and righteous. So they actively worked to discredit her? To make her look like she was lying or delusional? Not explicitly, Pemberton said carefully. But the effect was the same. Every denial reinforced the impression that she was mistaken or fabricating the relationship. And because the truth was classified, she had no way to prove otherwise. Except she had the medal, Irene said, holding up the leather case. How did she get this if everything was classified? Pemberton's expression shifted to something like respect. That's a good question, and honestly, I don't have a complete answer. The medals were supposed to be held in secure facilities. My theory is that your father somehow acquired his before the final mission, perhaps sensing he might not return. He may have given it to your mother as proof of his service, something she could keep if the worst happened. It was a romantic notion, Irene thought. Her father, knowing the dangers of his mission, making sure his girlfriend had something tangible to remember him by. Something that couldn't be erased by classification and bureaucracy. The fact that she held onto it for 30 years, Pemberton continued, that she never sold it or discarded it despite everyone telling her it was meaningless, speaks to her character and her certainty about your father. Irene felt tears threatening again. Her mother had been right all along. Every instinct, every memory, every claim that others had dismissed as fantasy or delusion had been absolutely true. She'd loved a soldier who died a hero, and the system had punished her for that love by denying it ever existed. What happens now? Irene asked. Now that I know the truth, what am I supposed to do with it? Pemberton was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. Officially, Operation Silent Guard remains classified. I've already violated protocol by showing you these documents. If you were to go public with what you've learned, there would be consequences for both of us. So I'm supposed to just accept this and remain silent? Irene asked, feeling the injustice of it. Keep my father's sacrifice secret just like the government has for 30 years? I'm not asking you to do that, Pemberton replied. In fact, I'm going to do something I should have done years ago when I first learned about the families who'd been left in the dark. He reached for a phone on the wall and dialed an extension. This is General Pemberton. Please connect me with the Ministry of Defense Liaison Office. Yes, I'll hold. While waiting, he turned back to Irene. There's a process for declassifying operations after a certain period. Operation Silent Guard has been sealed for 30 years. That's long enough. The extremist group no longer exists. The political landscape has changed. The threat of public panic has long since passed. It's time for your father and his team to be properly recognized. Irene's heart leaped. You can do that? You can declassify the operation? I can initiate the process, Pemberton clarified. It will require approval from several government agencies, and it won't happen overnight. But yes, I believe we can get Operation Silent Guard partially declassified, enough to acknowledge the 7 men who died and give their families the recognition they deserve. Someone answered on the other end of the phone, and Pemberton's tone became formal and commanding. This is General Pemberton at Thornfield Base. I'm requesting an immediate review for partial declassification of Operation Silent Guard, conducted in 1994. I'm invoking discretionary authority under Section 7 of the Classification Review Protocol. I need a response within 72 hours. He listened to whatever response came through, his expression firm. I understand the implications. Schedule the review. And inform the minister that this is non-negotiable. We have a family member on base who deserves answers, and I intend to provide them. After Pemberton hung up the phone, he turned back to Irene with an expression that mixed determination and something like relief, as if he'd been waiting years for an excuse to take this action. That will set things in motion, he said. But there's something else I want to show you while we wait for the bureaucracy to catch up with what's right. He gathered the documents from the table, carefully returning most of them to the folder but keeping the photograph of the 7 soldiers. Leading Irene back out of the archives room, they walked through more corridors until they reached a door marked Memorial Garden, authorized personnel only. Pemberton swiped his card again, and the door opened onto an outdoor space that took Irene's breath away. It was a small courtyard, perhaps 50 feet square, enclosed by stone walls covered in climbing ivy. In the center stood a fountain, its water trickling peacefully. Around the perimeter were 7 trees, each mature and healthy, their branches creating a canopy of green despite the autumn season. This garden was created in 1995, Pemberton explained, 1 year after Operation Silent Guard. It's not public, and most personnel on base don't know its true purpose. Officially, it's listed as a contemplation space for senior officers. But in reality, it's a memorial. He led her to a stone bench facing the fountain. On the ground before each tree was a small brass plaque, set flush with the grass so as not to draw attention. Pemberton knelt beside one of them and brushed away some fallen leaves. The plaque read simply, W.H. 1994 Silent Guardian. Irene dropped to her knees beside it, her fingers tracing the letters. It wasn't her father's full name, wasn't a proper memorial that told the world who he was and what he'd done. But it was something. Someone had cared enough to mark this place, to plant these trees, to create a space where her father's sacrifice was acknowledged, even if only in whispers and initials. Who created this? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. I did, Pemberton replied quietly. I was a major at the time, serving on the base but not directly involved in Operation Silent Guard. When I learned about the mission and its outcome, when I understood that 7 families had been left without answers or closure, it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't change the classification, couldn't acknowledge these men publicly. But I could do this. He gestured to the garden, to the trees standing as silent witnesses to sacrifice. Each tree represents one of the fallen. The plaques use initials only, in case anyone unauthorized ever accessed this space. But I know every name. I've made it my responsibility to remember them. Irene looked up at him, seeing him not as a general or a representative of the system that had failed her mother, but as a man who'd tried to do right within impossible constraints. Thank you, she whispered. For remembering them. For caring when you didn't have to. I did have to, Pemberton replied. That's what bothered me most about the classification. It was legally justified, perhaps even necessary at the time. But it turned these men into ghosts, and that wasn't acceptable. Heroes shouldn't disappear. They sat in silence for a while, the fountain's gentle sound creating a peaceful atmosphere that felt appropriate for contemplation. Irene thought about her mother, imagining how much it would have meant to her to know about this place, to have somewhere she could come and feel close to the man she'd loved. "My mother died thinking the world had forgotten him," Irene said. "Thinking she was the only person who remembered William Hill existed." "She wasn't," Pemberton assured her. "I come here once a month, every month, for the past 29 years. I read each name, including your father's full name, which I keep in my own private records. And I've thought often about the families, wondered if they were still searching for answers, still hoping for acknowledgement. Did you ever try to reach out to them?" Irene asked. Pemberton's expression grew troubled. "I wanted to. Many times. But I was constrained by the classification and by my position in the military. Making unauthorized contact with the families could have compromised operational security and ended my career, which would have meant losing my ability to advocate for eventual declassification from within the system." "So you waited," Irene said, understanding the impossible position but still feeling the weight of lost time. "I waited," Pemberton confirmed. "And I'm ashamed to say that while I waited, people like your mother suffered. That's a burden I'll carry for the rest of my life." His honesty was disarming. Irene had expected bureaucratic defensiveness, but instead found genuine remorse and a commitment to making things right, even if it came decades too late. "When the declassification goes through," Pemberton continued, "this garden will be properly dedicated. The plaques will be replaced with full names and service records. Families will be invited to memorial services. Your father and his team will finally receive the public recognition they earned." "How long will that take?" Irene asked. "Months, possibly longer," Pemberton admitted. "The government moves slowly, especially with classified materials. But I'm going to push hard. And having you here, having a family member demanding answers, gives me leverage I didn't have before." As they sat in the memorial garden, Irene's phone buzzed with messages from friends checking on her, wondering how her trip to the base was going. She'd told them she was finally going to get answers about her father, though she'd downplay her expectations, not wanting to seem as obsessed as her mother had been labeled. Now she could tell them the truth. Her father had been real. His service had mattered. Her mother hadn't been delusional or lying. The system had failed them, but the truth was finally emerging. "There's one more thing," Pemberton said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small USB drive. "I've compiled as much unclassified information about your father as I could access. Personal details from his service record, character references from his commanding officers, even some photographs from his time on base before Operation Silent Guard." He handed it to Irene, who accepted it with trembling hands. "This is yours. Information that should have been given to your mother 30 years ago. I can't give you back the time that was lost, but I can give you a fuller picture of who your father was." Irene clutched the USB drive like it was precious metal. Her entire life, her father had been more absence than presence, more story than person. The idea of having actual information about him, details that would help her understand the man beyond the tragedy, felt overwhelming. "Will I find out why he joined the military?" she asked. "What kind of person he was?" "Yes," Pemberton replied. "Your father was known as someone who believed deeply in service. His evaluations consistently noted his dedication, his concern for civilian safety, and his willingness to volunteer for difficult assignments. By all accounts, he was exactly the kind of soldier you'd want protecting your country." "My mother always said he was kind," Irene said softly. "She said he had a way of making people feel safe." "That matches everything I've read about him," Pemberton confirmed. William Hill was remembered fondly by everyone who served with him. When he volunteered for Operation Silent Guard, knowing the risks, his commanding officer noted that it was completely in character. "Your father saw a threat to innocent people and didn't hesitate to put himself in harm's way to stop it." It painted a picture that made Irene proud and heartbroken in equal measure. Her father had been a hero not just in the dramatic sense of dying on a dangerous mission, but in the everyday sense of being someone who consistently chose to do right by others. "I wish I could have known him," Irene said, stating the obvious but needing to voice it anyway. "He would have been proud of you," Pemberton replied. "Your determination to find the truth, your refusal to accept the dismissals and denials, that takes courage. You're your father's daughter." The words settled over Irene like a blessing. She'd spent her life defined by her father's absence, by being the girl without a dad, the daughter of a woman who couldn't let go. Now she was being recognized as someone who carried her father's legacy of determination and courage. "What about the other families?" Irene asked suddenly. "The 6 other men who died, do their families know? Have they been searching too?" Pemberton's expression grew somber. "I've kept track where I could. 2 of the soldiers were unmarried with no children. 3 others had families who eventually accepted the official story of training accidents and stopped asking questions. But there's one other situation similar to yours, a daughter who's spent years trying to prove her father existed. Have you contacted her?" Irene asked. "Not yet," Pemberton admitted. "But with the declassification process beginning, I will. She deserves the same answers you're getting." "They all do." Irene felt a kinship with this unknown woman, another daughter carrying the burden of an erased father. "I'd like to meet her," she said. "When the time is right, I'd like to connect with the families." "I think that's an excellent idea," Pemberton agreed. "When this becomes public, you'll all need each other's support. The attention will be intense, and having people who understand your experience will be valuable." They rose from the bench, and Irene took one last look at the plaque marking her father's tree. In a few months, if everything went as Pemberton promised, this secret memorial would become public recognition. Her father's name would be restored. Her mother's decades-long fight would be vindicated. As they walked back toward the administrative building, Irene felt a shift in how base personnel looked at her. Word must have spread about who she was and why she was there. Soldiers nodded respectfully as they passed, their earlier curiosity replaced by something like acknowledgement. "You've shaken things up today," Pemberton said with a slight smile. "Half the base is speculating about why the general personally escorted a civilian past security. The other half is already accessing what personnel records they can about Operation Silent Guard. Is that a problem?" Irene asked, worried she'd created difficulties for him. "No," Pemberton replied firmly. "It's overdue. These men have been silent guardians for 30 years. It's time they had voices again." General Pemberton led Irene to his private office, a spacious room on the 3rd floor of the command building. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs from various deployments, and maps marking operations spanning decades of service. His desk was orderly, with neat stacks of documents and a computer displaying what looked like classified briefings. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "I need to brief you on what happens next, and I want to be completely transparent about the challenges we'll face." Irene settled into the chair, still clutching the USB drive he'd given her. Through the office window, she could see portions of the base stretching toward distant hills, all of it now connected to her father's story in ways she was still processing. Pemberton sat behind his desk and pulled up something on his computer, then turned the screen so Irene could see it. It showed a flowchart detailing the declassification process, with multiple steps and approval stages marked in different colors. "This is what we're up against," he explained. "Declassifying a military operation requires review by the Ministry of Defense, the intelligence services, and often the Cabinet Office. Each agency has to certify that releasing information won't compromise national security, reveal operational methods, or endanger current operations." "How long does that normally take?" Irene asked, studying the complex diagram. "For most operations, 18 to 24 months, Pemberton replied. "But I'm going to push for an expedited review. Operation Silent Guard is 30 years old. The threat it addressed no longer exists. The methods used are outdated. There's no legitimate security reason to keep it classified indefinitely. But there could be political reasons, Irene said, understanding the unspoken implication. Admitting that chemical weapons were inside the country, that terrorists nearly succeeded in a mass attack, that could embarrass the government. Pemberton nodded approvingly. You understand the real obstacle. It's not security anymore, it's politics. Officials don't want to answer uncomfortable questions about why this was hidden for 3 decades, why families were left without answers, why soldiers who saved thousands of lives were erased from history. So what's your strategy? Irene asked. Pressure from multiple angles, Pemberton replied. I'm using my position and my connections with other senior officers who believe these men deserve recognition. I'm also going to quietly reach out to sympathetic members of Parliament who might ask questions that make it politically costly to keep this buried. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. And I'm counting on you to be the public face of this effort, if you're willing. A daughter searching for her father, holding evidence that proves he existed and served heroically, that's a narrative the media will amplify. That creates political pressure that can't be ignored. The idea of becoming a public figure, of sharing her family's pain with the world, made Irene's stomach tighten. She'd spent her life being the quiet daughter of the woman everyone pitied. Stepping into the spotlight seemed terrifying. But she thought about her mother, who'd fought alone for 30 years with no support, no acknowledgement, no allies within the system. Irene had what her mother never had, proof, a general willing to advocate, and the possibility of real change. I'll do it, Irene said firmly. Whatever it takes to get my father and the others recognized, I'll do it. Pemberton smiled with genuine warmth. I knew you would. You have your father's courage. He made several phone calls while Irene waited, each conversation brief but pointed. She heard him mention her name, reference Operation Silent Guard, and use phrases like moral obligation and overdue recognition. He was activating a network, pulling strings that had been waiting to be pulled. After the final call, he turned back to Irene. I've set up a meeting for tomorrow morning with a journalist I trust, someone who specializes in military affairs and has a track record of handling sensitive stories responsibly. She'll want to interview you, hear your story, and see the evidence. Tomorrow? Irene asked, feeling the timeline accelerating. Speed is essential, Pemberton explained. Once word spreads that you are here, that I'm pushing for declassification, there will be pressure to contain this quietly. We need to get your story out before that pressure can be applied effectively. What about the other families? Irene asked. Shouldn't they be part of this too? I'm reaching out to them today, Pemberton assured her. The daughter I mentioned earlier, her name is Catherine Reeves. Her father was Lieutenant Thomas Reeves, your father's team leader on Operation Silent Guard. I think you two should meet. He wrote down a phone number and handed it to Irene. She lives in Edinburgh. I'm going to call her this afternoon to explain what's happening. If you'd like to speak with her directly, I'm sure she'd appreciate hearing from someone who understands what she's been through. Irene took the number, feeling a connection to this stranger who shared her experience of searching for an erased father. I'll call her tonight. Good, Pemberton said. Unity among the families will strengthen your position. The government can dismiss one person as an anomaly, but multiple families demanding recognition is harder to ignore. Pemberton arranged for Irene to stay in the base guest quarters overnight, an unprecedented accommodation for a civilian, but one he justified as necessary given the sensitivity of their discussions. The room was simple but comfortable, with a single bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. Through the window, Irene could see the memorial garden where her father's tree stood. She spent the evening reviewing the contents of the USB drive on her laptop. Pemberton had compiled an extensive file, her father's enlistment records showing he'd joined at age 21, driven by a desire to serve after his own father had been a civilian casualty in a terrorist attack. Performance evaluations that consistently rated him as exceptional, with particular praise for his composure under pressure and his commitment to protecting civilian life. There were photographs too. Her father in basic training, looking young and determined. Her father with his unit, laughing at something outside the frame. her father receiving a commendation for excellence in tactical operations. Each image added dimension to the man who'd been only a flat photograph in her mother's stories. One document particularly caught Irene's attention, a letter her father had written to his commanding officer, volunteering for Operation Silent Guard. The language was formal, military in its precision, but the intent was clear. He'd understood the risks and accepted them because he believed the mission was necessary to protect innocent people. "I am prepared to make whatever sacrifice is required," the letter concluded. "The safety of civilians must be our highest priority." Reading those words, written in her father's own hand just weeks before his death, made him feel present in a way nothing else had. This wasn't a story her mother had told or a record someone else had created. This was her father's voice, speaking across 30 years, explaining why he'd made the choice that orphaned her before she was born. Irene wiped tears from her cheeks and continued reading. There were medical records showing her father had been in excellent health. Training certifications documenting his expertise in weapons, tactics, and emergency response. Even a few personal notes from fellow soldiers, remembering him fondly after his death, though the notes carefully avoided mentioning Operation Silent Guard by name. When she finally looked up from the laptop, hours had passed. The base outside her window had settled into evening routines, with lights glowing in various buildings and occasional vehicles moving along the roads. This place had been her father's home for the last years of his life. He'd walked these paths, worked in these buildings, prepared for the mission that would kill him. Irene picked up her phone and stared at the number Pemberton had given her for Catherine Reeves. It was late, but not too late. She dialed before she could talk herself out of it. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious and slightly wary. "Hello? Is this Catherine Reeves?" Irene asked. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is Irene Hill. General Pemberton gave me your number. I think we have something important in common." There was a pause, then Catherine's voice returned, now charged with emotion. "Your father was on the team. Operation Silent Guard." "Yes," Irene confirmed. "My father was William Hill. He served with your father." Catherine exhaled sharply, a sound that carried years of isolation and sudden relief. "I thought I was the only one still searching. Everyone told me I was wasting my time, that I should accept what the military said and move on. But I couldn't. Neither could my mother," Irene said. "She spent 30 years trying to prove my father existed. She died 6 months ago without ever getting acknowledgement." "I'm so sorry," Catherine said softly. "My mother's still alive, but this search has consumed her too. She's 70 now, and she's never remarried, never really moved forward. She's been waiting for someone to tell her the truth about what happened to my father." They talked for over an hour, comparing their experiences, sharing the parallel stories of denial and dismissal. Catherine had been 5 years old when her father died, old enough to have actual memories of him rather than just photographs and stories. She remembered his laugh, the way he'd read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, how he'd promised to take her to the zoo when he returned from his business trip. "I've spent 25 years being told those memories weren't real," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "That I'd confused him with someone else, that my mother had invented a fantasy to cope with being a single parent. But I know what I remember. He was real." "He was real," Irene confirmed. "They were all real. And finally, someone's going to acknowledge that." Catherine was silent for a moment, then asked the question Irene knew was coming. "Do you really think General Pemberton can get the operation declassified? Or is this just another false hope?" "I think he's genuinely committed," Irene replied. "And I think having multiple families demanding recognition gives us leverage we've never had before. He mentioned there might be others too, families of the other soldiers who died. We should find them," Catherine said immediately. "If we present a united front, the government will have a harder time dismissing us." The next morning, Irene met the journalist General Pemberton had contacted. Her name was Rebecca Walsh, a veteran reporter who'd spent 15 years covering military affairs for a major national newspaper. She arrived at the base with a photographer, both granted special access after extensive security vetting. They met in a conference room, where Pemberton had arranged for privacy. Rebecca was in her 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to assess everything simultaneously. She shook Irene's hand with a firm grip, then settled into a chair with a digital recorder and notebook. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Rebecca began. "General Pemberton briefed me on the basic outline, but I'd like to hear your story in your own words." Irene took a deep breath and began with her mother's death 6 months earlier, the discovery of the medal and photograph, the years of watching her mother being dismissed and discredited. She explained her decision to come to the base, her confrontation at the gate, and the moment when the general had finally acknowledged the truth. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting Irene tell the story uninterrupted. The photographer took discreet photos of Irene holding the medal, of the photograph showing her parents together, of documents Pemberton had cleared for public release. "This is extraordinary," Rebecca said when Irene finished. "A 30-year cover-up of soldiers who died preventing a terrorist attack. Families left without answers. A system that chose secrecy over acknowledgement. This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told. When will it run?" Irene asked. "I'll need a few days to verify details and get official responses from the Ministry of Defense," Rebecca explained. "But I'm aiming for this Sunday's edition. Front page, with a full feature spread inside. This will get national attention." General Pemberton, who'd been sitting quietly during the interview, spoke up. "I've also prepared a statement that I'll release to coincide with your article. As base commander, I'm formally recommending the declassification of Operation Silent Guard and public recognition for the 7 soldiers who died during the mission." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. "That's a significant professional risk for you, General. You're essentially challenging the classification system and criticizing how the government handled this." "Yes," Pemberton agreed simply. "But it's the right thing to do. I've spent 3 decades watching families suffer because of decisions made in the name of security. That suffering served no purpose except to protect bureaucrats from uncomfortable questions. It ends now." After the interview concluded and Rebecca left to begin writing her story, Pemberton suggested Irene take another walk through the memorial garden. "You may not get many chances for quiet reflection once the story breaks," he said. "Things are going to move very quickly, and it will be overwhelming." Irene welcomed the opportunity. She walked to her father's tree and sat on the grass beside the plaque, letting the peace of the garden settle over her. Soon this place would be public, would be visited by families and dignitaries and people who wanted to pay respects to the silent guardians. Her phone rang. It was Catherine Reeves. "I've been thinking about what happens after the story comes out," Catherine said without preamble. "The government is going to try to control the narrative, to minimize their role in keeping this secret. We need to be prepared to keep pushing." "What do you suggest?" Irene asked. "We organize," Catherine replied. "We find the other families, we coordinate our message, and we make it clear that we won't accept partial acknowledgement or quiet apologies. Our fathers and the others deserve full recognition, public memorials, and compensation for the families who suffered because of the government's secrecy." Irene hadn't thought about compensation, but Catherine was right. Her mother had struggled financially as a single parent, denied military survivor benefits because her partner's service was officially non-existent. The same was probably true for other families. "General Pemberton said he'd help us contact the other families," Irene said. "He already did," Catherine replied. "I got calls this morning from 2 other family members. One is the widow of another soldier, she's elderly now but still sharp. The other is a brother who's been searching for answers about his siblings' disappearance. They're both willing to be part of this." That's 4 families, Irene calculated. And there were 7 soldiers total. The general said 2 were unmarried with no children, and the 3rd soldier's family accepted the official story and moved on, Catherine explained. "So it's just us 4. But that's enough. We're going to make sure no one can ignore this." They spent another hour planning, discussing strategy, and coordinating their approach. Catherine had experience with advocacy, having worked with veterans' rights organizations during her own search for answers. She understood how to navigate media attention, how to pressure politicians, how to turn individual stories into a movement. By the time they finished talking, Irene felt less alone than she had since her mother's death. She was part of something larger now, connected to people who understood her experience and shared her determination to get justice for the men who'd been erased from history. The story broke on Sunday morning, exactly as Rebecca Walsh had promised. The front page featured a striking image of Irene holding her father's medal, with the headline, "The Silent Guardians, Families Demand Recognition for Heroes Erased by Government Secrecy." The article was comprehensive and damning. Rebecca had contextualized Operation Silent Guard within the broader pattern of government classification and secrecy. She'd interviewed not just Irene, but Catherine and the other family members who'd agreed to speak. She'd gotten statements from military historians who confirmed that the Valor Cross was a legitimate but classified commendation. And she'd included pointed questions directed at government officials about why families had been left without answers for 3 decades. The Ministry of Defense's response, included in the article, was carefully worded and defensive: "We cannot comment on specific classified operations. All classification decisions are made in accordance with national security requirements and legal protocols. We take seriously our obligations to service members and their families." It was exactly the kind of non-answer that had frustrated Irene's mother for 30 years. But now, with public attention focused on the issue, that evasiveness looked like exactly what it was: a cover-up. The story exploded across social media within hours. #SilentGuardians began trending on Twitter. News programs picked up the story for their evening broadcasts. Politicians from various parties began making statements, some supporting declassification, others defending the classification system while expressing sympathy for the families. Irene's phone rang constantly with interview requests from television programs, radio shows, and other newspapers. Catherine helped her navigate the media attention, advising which interviews to accept and which to decline, how to stay on message, and how to avoid being manipulated by reporters looking for sensational quotes rather than substantive coverage. By Monday afternoon, there were protests outside the Ministry of Defense building in London. Veterans organizations and civil liberties groups had organized demonstrations demanding transparency and recognition for the Silent Guardians. The story had touched a nerve, connecting to broader public frustration with government secrecy and lack of accountability. General Pemberton called Irene that evening, his voice carrying satisfaction despite obvious exhaustion. The ministry has agreed to an expedited declassification review. They're facing too much pressure to stonewall anymore. We're talking weeks now, not months. That's incredible, Irene said, hardly believing how quickly things were moving. It's the power of sunlight, Pemberton replied. Secrecy thrives in darkness. Once you exposed this to public scrutiny, the political calculus changed completely. Politicians are now competing to be seen as supporting recognition for the Silent Guardians rather than defending the cover-up. What happens next? Irene asked. There will be hearings, probably in Parliament. You and the other families will be invited to testify. The government will try to frame this as a regrettable but understandable mistake rather than a systematic failure. You'll need to push back against that narrative. We will, Irene assured him. Catherine's already preparing testimony that documents exactly how the system failed our families. Good, Pemberton said. And Irene, one more thing. The base is planning a formal memorial ceremony for when the declassification is complete. The secret garden will be rededicated as a public memorial, with full names and service records. I'd like you and the other families to be part of planning that ceremony. Irene felt tears welling up. A public memorial. Her father's name spoken aloud and celebrated rather than hidden and denied. It was everything her mother had wanted and never received. My mother should be here for this, Irene said softly. She is, Pemberton replied gently. Her 30 years of refusing to give up, of insisting on the truth even when everyone dismissed her, that's what made this moment possible. She fought this battle long before you picked up the torch. The victory belongs to her as much as to anyone." After hanging up, Irene sat in her London flat, surrounded by her mother's belongings that she still hadn't fully sorted through. She pulled out the box of rejected letters, the documentation of 3 decades of denial. Each letter represented a moment when her mother had chosen to keep fighting despite having every reason to give up. Irene understood now what had driven her mother's persistence. It wasn't just about acknowledgement or official recognition. It was about love, about refusing to let the man she'd loved be erased, about ensuring that her daughter would know her father had been real and had mattered. "We did it, Mom," Irene whispered to the empty room. "We proved you were right all along." Her phone buzzed with another message from Catherine. "Parliament has scheduled hearings for next week. They want all family members to testify. This is happening." Irene replied quickly, "We'll be ready." She looked at her father's photograph one more time, studying his face with new understanding. He'd been a man who'd chosen service over safety, who'd volunteered for a dangerous mission because he believed protecting innocent people mattered more than his own survival. And now, finally, the world would know what he'd done. The system had tried to erase William Hill and his 6 comrades. But love had proved more powerful than classification, more enduring than bureaucratic denial. A mother's 30-year fight and a daughter's determination had brought the silent guardians back from the shadows. The parliamentary hearing took place in a grand committee room that smelled of old wood and older secrets. Irene sat at a long table facing rows of members of parliament, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to skeptical. Beside her sat Catherine Reeves, Eleanor Morrison, the widow of another silent guardian, and James Thornton, whose brother had died in Operation Silent Guard. The room was packed with journalists, military officials, and members of the public who'd queued for hours to witness what had become a national reckoning with government secrecy. Cameras lined the back wall, broadcasting the hearing live to millions watching at home. The committee chair, a senior MP named Richard Ashworth, called the session to order. "We're here to examine the circumstances surrounding Operation Silent Guard and the government's handling of information related to 7 soldiers who died during that mission in 1994. I want to begin by hearing directly from the families who have been affected." Irene was called to speak first. She approached the microphone, her prepared statement trembling slightly in her hands. But when she began speaking, her voice was steady, strengthened by the knowledge that her mother's ghost was watching, that 30 years of silence were finally ending. "My name is Irene Hill, and I'm here to speak about my father, William Hill, who died preventing a terrorist attack that would have killed thousands of people. But I'm also here to speak about my mother, who spent 30 years being called a liar for insisting my father had existed. Who was dismissed, discredited, and denied every time she sought answers about the man she loved." She detailed the letters her mother had written, the official denials she'd received, the systematic way the government had protected its secrets at the expense of grieving families. "My mother died 6 months ago without ever receiving acknowledgement. She never got to hear anyone say, 'You were right. Your love was real. His sacrifice mattered.' That's what this system took from her." Several MPs shifted uncomfortably. The government officials present maintained carefully neutral expressions, but Irene could see the calculation in their eyes. This wasn't just about historical records anymore, it was about contemporary accountability. Catherine testified next, describing how she'd grown up doubting her own memories because everyone told her they were false. "I was 5 years old when my father died. I remembered him clearly, his voice, his laugh, the way he'd promised to come home soon. But the government said he'd never existed, that my mother had invented him. Do you understand what that does to a child? To be told your memories are lies." Eleanor Morrison spoke about financial hardship, about raising children alone without the military survivor benefits she should have received. "I worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table while the government that my husband died serving denied he'd ever worn a uniform. I'm 73 years old now, and I've lived with that injustice for most of my life." James Thornton, the youngest of the group at 38, spoke about discovering his brother had been declared dead in a training accident that never actually occurred. "I was 8 when I was told my brother died. 20 years later, I started researching that supposed training accident and found no record of it anywhere. That's when I knew something was wrong. But when I tried to investigate, I was stonewalled at every turn. After the families testified, the committee questioned Ministry of Defense officials about the classification decisions and the handling of family inquiries. The officials defended their actions with technical explanations about national security requirements and legal obligations, but their arguments rang hollow in the face of the human cost detailed by the families. He read each name aloud, and as he did, family members stepped forward to unveil the memorial stones. Irene approached her father's memorial, her hands resting on the cool granite that bore his name, William Hill, Specialist, 1969 to 1994. Silent Guardian. His courage saved thousands. His sacrifice will never be forgotten. Beneath the inscription was a photograph, the same one from her mother's box, showing her father in his uniform, young and proud. But now it was mounted permanently, ensuring that everyone who visited this garden would see his face and know his story. Eleanor Morrison placed flowers at her husband's memorial, her elderly hands trembling. Catherine Reeves stood before her father's stone with her own daughter, a young woman who'd grown up never knowing her grandfather but who would now have a place to connect with his memory. James Thornton saluted his brother's memorial, finally able to properly grieve after decades of ambiguous loss. After the official ceremony concluded, the Minister of Defense approached the families privately. On behalf of the government, I want to formally apologize for how your inquiries were handled. You deserved acknowledgement and support, and instead you received denials and dismissals. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. It was an official apology, carefully worded by lawyers, but it represented something that had seemed impossible just months earlier: government accountability. More significant than the apology was what followed. The families received full military survivor benefits, backdated to 1994 with interest. A scholarship fund was established in the names of the 7 silent guardians, supporting children of military families. And the government committed to reviewing other classified operations to identify similar cases where families had been left without answers. As the crowd dispersed and the sun began setting over the base, Irene remained in the garden, sitting on the bench where General Pemberton had first told her about the secret memorial. She pulled out the photograph of her parents, the one that had started everything. "We did it, Mom," she said softly. "Everyone knows now. Everyone knows Dad was real, that he was a hero, that your love mattered. You were right all along." A hand touched her shoulder. Catherine Reeves sat down beside her, her own eyes red from crying. "My mother watched the ceremony from Edinburgh. She's too frail to travel now, but she watched every moment on television. Afterward, she said it was the first day in 30 years she felt like she could finally breathe properly." "I wish my mother had lived to see this," Irene said. "She did see it," Catherine replied. "Maybe not this exact ceremony, but she saw it in your determination when you went to those gates with her evidence. She saw it in every moment of her 30-year fight. This victory belongs to all the mothers and fathers and siblings and children who refused to accept that their loved ones didn't matter." As darkness fell over Thornfield Base, lights illuminated the memorial garden, ensuring the 7 names remained visible even after sunset. The silent guardians were silent no more. Their names would be remembered. Their sacrifice would be honored. And their families, after 3 decades in the shadows, could finally stand in the light. Irene traced her father's name one final time, then stood to leave. Tomorrow, she would return to her life in London, to her job at the library and her friends who'd supported her through this journey. But she would return to this garden regularly, to this place where her father's memory was preserved in stone and living wood. She'd come to these gates months ago as a daughter desperate for answers, dismissed by guards who saw only a civilian with a story that didn't make sense. She was leaving as a woman who'd changed history, who'd proven that persistence and truth could overcome even the most entrenched secrecy. The medal that had opened the gates now sat in a secure display case inside the base museum, alongside the other 6 Valor Crosses that had been recovered from classified archives. Visitors would see them and learn about Operation Silent Guard, about 7 soldiers who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, and about the families who'd fought to ensure that sacrifice was never forgotten. As Irene walked toward the base exit, General Pemberton fell into step beside her. "Your mother would be proud of what you've accomplished." "She accomplished it," Irene corrected. "I just finished what she started." "Then let's say you accomplished it together," Pemberton suggested. "A 30-year fight that ended in victory. That's a legacy worth celebrating." Irene nodded, feeling at peace for the first time since her mother's death. The battle was over. The truth had prevailed. And somewhere, she believed, her mother and father were finally reunited, no longer separated by secrecy and denial, but together in whatever place waited beyond this life. The gates of Thornfield Base closed behind her, but this time they weren't shutting her out. They were protecting the memorial that bore her father's name, the recognition he'd earned, and the truth that could never again be hidden. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.